Is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Hunter.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, for the call. I'm a little bit confused why I'm speaking before the chairman of the committee, but I take that as a great honour and a privilege, and I thank the chamber for the opportunity. But in opening with my remarks, I'd like to acknowledge the member for Grey, the chairman of the committee, and the member for Hotham in her absence in this chamber, the Deputy Chair of the committee, and all members who put in an extraordinary large amount of work on this inquiry, a very important inquiry, and one of which, of course, has attracted a little bit more attention than we might have expected, given recent food security, food safety concerns, particularly the well-publicised China berries incident and the potential link to a hepatitis A outbreak. We heard from many witnesses who expressed many different views, which again highlights the complexity of this issue. To the consumer, it all seems very, very simple. Just tell us simply, in a graphic way, if possible, where this food is coming from. But of course, those of us who have had an opportunity and through the privileges granted to us in this place, know it's far more complex than that. For example, if I think the example was used throughout the work of the committee of blueberries are brought into Australia from, let's say, China, and those blueberries are made to manufacture a pie in Australia, then it's a good thing for Australian companies to be able to say that, in part at least, that pie was manufactured in Australia, because people are looking for an opportunity to back Australian products. But how you put the complexity of that case into a label, exactly how much was done in Australia, was it 49%, was it 50%, was it 51%, etc. Now, consumers will have a different view, different views generally about whether it should be 49 or 50 or 51%, etc., which is understandable and justifiable. But trying to put all those complexities into a label, a simple label that gives a one-glance snapshot at, what was done locally and what was done somewhere else here is very, very difficult indeed. And the committee was mindful, of course, of the need not to ensure that Australian manufacturers, those who are transforming imported fruit or vegetables or whatever it might be, into an Australian final use product, to be very careful not to undermine their business prospects by denying them the opportunity to indicate that it's a product made in Australia. So this is very, very difficult, and I believe the committee made some very sensible recommendations. I had proposed to read them into the record, but I think that will probably be done by the chairman, if not someone else, so I won't use my time doing so. But sensible recommendations, which I think get the balance pretty right. They are not perfect, not by any stretch. We weren't able to find the perfect solutions, but we did our very best to put forward something which is better than what is currently in place, and hopefully which gives consumers a better guide as to where the product they are consuming is coming from. Of course, we dealt with all the complexities of fresh and frozen foods that come through New Zealand from places like China, and how we deal with those under FSANZ, and of course the closer economic relations we have with China. These things make the issues here more complex yet again. But I think I should say, Madam Speaker, that it's not just all about food labelling, and we really need to be careful in responding to the Chinese berries outbreak, for example, with a labelling response only. I understand consumers think this is a labelling issue. It is in part, but of course the systems we have in place to ensure that the food we are importing from other nation states meets the same standards as we would expect here in Australia is every bit as important, if not, well, I would say more important than what we place on labels. For example, the berries, again, the berries incident out of China, the goods were clearly marked produce of China. It wasn't up there in flashing lights, I admit, but it was pretty clear to anyone who takes a look at labels, and of course not all consumers take a look at labels. I'm looking at them myself more diligently than I was doing so before the China berry incident, but it was clearly marked produce of China. So, you know, we've got to be careful to give the consumers, the Australian electorate, the impression that we can fix this problem with a labelling solution alone. We can't. We have to do something on labelling, but we also need to ensure that we have the very, very best biosecurity system in the world, and that the testing systems, the verification systems we rely upon to test things like China-based berries before they come to this country, and indeed when they arrive in this country, must also be the very best in the world. Now, Madam Speaker, that takes me to a subject very close to my heart, and that is the position of the Inspector General for Biosecurity. The Inspector General is the last cop on the beat. He's the guy who sits in the Department of Ag in Biosecurity, which was previously called Quarantine, and ensures that all of our systems are working. He's independent of the government. He can decide to initiate an inquiry into part of the biosecurity process if he has concerns from any source that the system has the potential to break down or is indeed breaking down. Now, as I speak, as I'm on my feet in the Senate, the government for some reason is bringing on the biosecurity bill. I don't know why it's rushing it now, why it's suddenly bringing it on now, and I think a quorum was just called there as a sort of a response to that surprise. But I'm calling upon the government again today, and I will be having Labor senators move amendments in the Senate sometime soon to restore the powers and independence and tenure of the Inspector General for Biosecurity. Why would the government undermine this position? It just makes no sense to me. I'm appealing to government members to talk to the Agriculture Minister and say, just fix this thing. You know, Barnaby Joyce, the Minister for Agriculture, if this bill passes in its current form, he becomes, in effect, the Inspector General for Biosecurity. Is the broader community going to feel comfortable with that prospect? So there's a breakdown in biosecurity in the department, and people are going to rely upon the Minister to decide whether we should have an investigation into the breakdown. Now, like any minister, this is not a, any minister would be concerned about an inquiry that might just show that somehow him or her as minister might have failed in some way which caused the breakdown. So you can't have the minister deciding these things. We need an independent statutory officer looking at these things through the eyes of an independent player and with the power to determine what things are looked at and what are not. On another issue, Madam Speaker, we had revelations today on ABC radio that the government has abolished the National Produce Monitoring System. Now, this is a system the Labor government put in place in cooperation with the states through the COAG process, specifically with the Standing Council on Primary Industry Ministers, which the government abolished too. It's gone, Scopey. There's no format for the Commonwealth and state ministers to get together on these very important issues anymore, very important issues. Scopey identified gaps because we've got all these state-based systems looking at chemical residues in our fresh produce. We go to the market gardens on a Sunday. We're buying produce, great market gardens, and we've got the best system in the world, but it identified gaps because all states are doing things differently. So Scopey decided that we should spend some money on a pilot project over 5 years to collect the data we need to determine whether these gaps really matter, whether there is a food safety threat to consumers, so we can rely on the science, we can gather the data and ensure that we have the world's best food safety program. But a year in, the government's abolished the scheme. The government has abolished the scheme at the very time when Australian consumers are, because of the China berry incident, concerned about food safety and what they are consuming. Chemicals are important. Our farmers must have them. But consumers are entitled to know that the system is not letting them down, and the chemical residues in the food they're buying at the market are not so high as to pose a threat to their health and safety. So I call upon the government to rethink this, to rethink this very, very silly idea. Barnaby Joyce, the minister, described it as a savings measure. I would have thought the last place the government would go for a savings measure is to food safety in this current political environment. This is a mistake. The Inspector-General needs to be restored with all of his powers and independence, and the government must do something to redress this very bad decision.
Thank you, Member for Hunter. The question is that the document